Have you ever wondered if you might be hypersexual, or is it just a high sex drive? I'm Dr. Rena Malik, urologist and pelvic surgeon, and we're going to talk all about hypersexuality today. Most people, after having sex, feel sexually satisfied for hours or even days after having sex. But some people, especially those who are hypersexual, describe feeling like they're never satisfied, or they only feel satisfied for just a few minutes before they start having the urge for more sex. Some people tell me that the urge comes back even before they're done having sex. So hypersexuality is sort of a very controversial topic, and there's actually a lot of debate in the medical community about what it is and how to define it. By the end of this video, you're going to understand the cycle that controls sexual satisfaction, learn exactly where that cycle breaks down for some people, and discover what treatments can help people who might be struggling. If you find yourself wanting to know what's normal, like the difference between hypersexuality and a high sex drive because you're just not sure, well, I have just the thing for you. Check out my brand new app designed exactly for you. It is called the Better Sex app, and it was developed entirely by me and is designed with the science-backed answers to all the questions you're too embarrassed to ask. And I can't tell you how excited about it I am. It is transformative. You can use it at your own pace. It includes 12 modules to help you become better at sex through knowledge, practical health tips, and intimacy challenges. Plus, you get me as your AI coach in your pocket. Make sure to check it out today at studio.com/Rena. Okay, let's start with how sexual satisfaction is supposed to work. Any sort of sexual event starts with an urge. You see something, hear something, feel something that gives you the urge for sex. You then proceed to have the sexual behavior. That could be masturbation, that could be sex of any kind. And then you go on to sexual satiation. This is where you no longer have that initial urge for sex and you start feeling satisfied during the moment. It's then followed by this thing called post-sexual satiation. It's essentially you're done having sex, your urge is pretty much gone, and you're back to your normal baseline of non-sexual arousal where most of us live most of the time. Now, here's what's important. The average person can have a sexual urge and not act on it, right? You might be busy, you might be at work, you might just be like, hey, it's not the right time, and you have control over whether you can act on it or not. And after you do have sex, most people are satisfied, right? Like I said, most people can go hours, days without having sex again. Your body and mind feel fulfilled. You're not constantly thinking about when you can have sex again or how soon it's going to happen. But for some people who struggle with hypersexuality, and this is not just a high sex drive, this cycle looks completely different. And the difference is that these people with hypersexuality have an urge that they cannot suppress. They literally have to act on it, otherwise they feel out of control. It's not a choice, it's almost like a compulsion. They also feel like they're never satiated, or they're only satiated for a very short period of time. The other interesting thing is that when they get these sexual urges, they go into a state called cognitive abeyance. Basically, all their logical thought goes to the wayside. They're no longer balancing the reward of sex and thinking about the risks of proceeding with that activity. It's kind of like a cognitive trance-like state. So they're focused and completely 100% immersed in thinking about that sexual urge and doing whatever they need to do to complete that urge. Now, this is very different from just having a high sex drive. People with a high sex drive, they just want sex, but they can control their urges and they don't feel this constant urge to have sex no matter the consequence. And that's just a variation of normal. The challenge is that people who have a high sex drive still get shamed by people around them. And then they start to feel like something is really wrong with them. The reality is that sex drive varies. There's nothing wrong with having a high sex drive, but generally it's a great idea to find a partner who has a matching or similar sex drive, or consider if your partner's okay with things like consensual non-monogamy or other things like that. Again, back to people who have hypersexuality, these people, the behavior has become compulsive and is causing harm to their lives. So basically, there's 3 things that need to be happening to be considered hypersexual. One is that you're having a preoccupation with sexual desires, sexual fantasies, and that the act is really difficult to control. Number 2 is you're having a lot of sexual behaviors. That could be masturbation, that could be sex with a person, that could be telephone sex, and that can be excessive use of pornography. And number 3, it's causing distress to you or your family. Now, the World Health Organization's ICD-11, that's the ICE International Classification of Diseases, has an official diagnosis called the compulsive sexual behavior disorder, or CSBD. And this definition is important because it helps us distinguish people who have a high sex drive and someone who's dealing with a compulsive disorder. I would say that this is not necessarily fleshed out completely in the scientific literature, but they define it as a persistent pattern of failure to control intense, repetitive sexual impulses or urges, resulting in repetitive sexual behavior. The pattern must be present for an extended period, like 6 months or more, and it can't be explained by another condition, like a manic episode, a bipolar disorder, related to being altered or anything like that. And there has to be 4 key features. Number 1, the repetitive sexual behaviors become central focus of the person's life to the point where they're now neglecting maybe their health, their personal care, or other important interests, activities, or responsibilities. So you're not just having a lot of sex, your entire life basically revolves around sex. Number 2, you've made numerous unsuccessful efforts to control or significantly reduce that repetitive sexual behavior. Number 3, you keep having this repetitive behavior despite it having negative consequences. So this could be that you're having relationship breakdowns, job loss, financial problems, or other health risks like from sexually transmitted infections. And you know it's causing harm, but you can't stop. And 4th, this one actually really surprised me. You continue the behavior even when you don't get any satisfaction from it. So you're not even enjoying it anymore, but you can't stop. And of course, this has to cause distress or significant impairment in your life, right? Personal, family, social, educational, work, anything. But the distress can't come from just feeling guilty. It has to actually have measured impacts on your overall life and multiple areas of your life. Guys, this is the question that everybody wants to know. How much sex is too much? Like, is it the number of times you have sex or the amount of time you're spending having sex? Now, there was one research group that wanted to figure out the amount and frequency of orgasms, which is sort of normal, and beyond which is considered to be abnormal. And they tried doing multiple surveys of many, many men in this case to identify how many times people are reaching orgasm through a variety of methods. That could be through partnered sex, through masturbation, and ultimately they found that it was extremely rare for people to have more than 7 orgasms per week. And so based on this, they basically said any person, a man or woman, who had more than 7 orgasms per week that was sustained for 6 months, and they spent more than 1 or 2 hours on sexual activities that ended in orgasm would be considered hypersexual. Now, guys, I have a real problem with this definition because people can have lots of sex and lots of orgasms, and they can have no distress. They can have great quality of life. They're not preoccupied, and they're just having a lot of sex. So I don't love this study, but I wanted to bring it up because I think it's so interesting and just an example of how research gets it wrong sometimes. So I ran my own experiment, and I asked here on YouTube as well as on Instagram and I polled people on how often they're orgasming per week, and these are the responses I got. Okay, let's start with YouTube. YouTube, we got 14,000 responses. About 13% said they have more than 7 orgasms per month, and the remainder, 4 to 7, was about 25%, 1 to 3 was about 44%, and 0 was about 17%. I don't think 13% of the population is hypersexual. Now, interestingly, I found very similar answers on Instagram. And Instagram, I have a little bit more of a female audience. On my Instagram stories, we got about 400 or so responses, and they were very similar to the YouTube responses. But I also put a poll in the feed, and I also got around 500 responses here. But the interesting part here was 0 was a lot lower. So only 5% of people said they didn't have any orgasms on average in a week. But the remainder of the numbers were very similar. 4 to 7 got a little higher. So it was around 35%. But ultimately, again, around 15% or a little bit lower was what I saw for people who have orgasmed more than 7 times a week. Again, I don't think this is a problem. I think it's completely normal and healthy as long as you're not meeting those other criteria. So why do some people have this issue? Now, there are some neurological reasons that this happens. And so these 2 major reasons are sort of on a spectrum, and they seem very opposite. One is sexual compulsivity and one is sexual impulsivity. Now, compulsivity is essentially like people who have OCD. So when someone has a compulsion, they get a thought that is so difficult to ignore that the only way for them to get through that is to do the action. So similarly, it's thought that people who have hypersexuality, have these intrusive, obsessive thoughts, and they need to actually have sex to get rid of the thought. Oftentimes in these characteristics, they find that people are using sex to self-soothe themselves through maybe significant anxiety, depression, or mood conditions. And here's the thing, I think this ICD definition is a bit flawed because I don't think they've actually looked very clearly. Are these symptoms a sequelae of other mood conditions? Like if we treat the depression, anxiety, will this go away? And I think that's the big thing here. If you are struggling with hypersexuality or significant porn use, I think you need to be screened for these other mood disorders because fixing those may help you ultimately deal with the underlying problem. And the other side of this is impulsivity. It's essentially the inability to resist the urge to have sex. So in this case, you think about when you have sex, you have pleasure. And pleasure reinforces the desire to then be impulsive again to try and achieve that pleasure. So what ultimately happens is people feel this strong sense of tension, which during the act, they get this immense relief and gratification, but once it's over, they feel guilty and the cycle repeats itself. So the way to think about this is compulsivity is using the act to get away from negative feelings, oftentimes like anxiety, stress, and depression. Whereas impulsivity is using the act to gain a positive reward or pleasure. And they're sort of on a spectrum. I tend to think it's more of a compulsivity issue than an impulsivity issue. Of course, the other theory is that hypersexuality is secondary to trauma and stress disorders. So people who experience trauma and stress during childhood have difficulty then regulating their body's normal systems of desire and arousal. They then go on to have difficulty forming intimate relationships, and they have abnormal levels of desire and arousal. Now, sex addiction comes up. Addiction has some very few characteristics. One is that you need increasing amounts of whatever thing you are addicted to achieve the same level of pleasure. And the second thing is that you begin to have dependence on this substance or thing you're addicted to. And if you don't have it, you get withdrawal symptoms when it's taken away. And you need more and more of the same substance or thing to achieve that same kind of satiation that you did previously. So for example, sex once a day just doesn't do the trick anymore. You need sex twice a day, then 3 times a day, and so on and so forth. Now, when they've looked at the brains of people who have issues with hypersexuality, they've seen increased activity in certain parts of the brain that are involved in pathways of motivation and reward, as well as memory. So these areas get highly activated so that when people have sexual urges, their motivation for them is higher and their reward response is higher. They may have some dysregulation, basically in the frontal or reasoning parts of their brain, which makes it more difficult for them to make good decisions. So they have less judgment and they can then be more impulsive. Now, the other thing is obviously there's hormones involved in sexual excitation or sexual inhibition. And some of these hormones include things like dopamine and testosterone. So what we see is that in certain medical conditions or with certain medications that you might take for certain medical conditions, you can actually get a side effect of hypersexuality. For example, people who have Parkinson's disease often take medications that increase dopamine. And so when you increase dopamine, they tend to have more hypersexual behavior. Similarly, we can see it in people taking medications for seizures, people who've had brain injuries to those areas, or who have dementia even. I think the important thing here, guys, is this is a real medical condition. And when this compulsive sexual behavior goes untreated, some of the consequences can be really detrimental. One is if you're having unprotected sex, potentially with multiple partners, you're at a higher risk for sexually transmitted infections, or you can have unwanted pregnancies. Number 2, this can be a huge strain on your relationships, romantic or not. They can create distress and conflict and cause you to personally feel loss of self-esteem and loneliness. And lastly, because you're so preoccupied with having sex, it might mean that you're not doing a great job at work, so you might have difficulty keeping a position. You might be spending a lot of your money on potentially using escorts or other sexual services, and so financially you can be detrimental. And of course, if you are engaging in sexual offenses, this can have legal ramifications. The good news is this is very rare. Studies show that hypersexuality is anywhere from 2 to 10% of people, but it is a real problem. problem. So if you think this sounds like you, I strongly recommend you see a psychiatrist to help discuss the issues at hand. There are a number of medical and psychological treatments available, and it is treatable. In terms of medical treatments, you can take antidepressants, specifically selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors or SSRIs. These medications actually increase serotonin, which causes an inhibition of sexual thought and desire. And so these can be very effective. You could also, in severe circumstances, take things like anti-androgens, which reduce testosterone. Now, I tend to not really like this idea because these can have other downstream sequelae on other parts of your body, like brain health, muscle health. I tend to not recommend using anti-androgens if you can avoid it. And I've personally never used them for anything except for treating something like advanced prostate cancer. Now, there have been some medications which have shown benefit, which include things like naltrexone, which is used for addiction treatment, and mood stabilizers for people where they also have mood disorders. And even antipsychotics or anti-anxiety medications can potentially be helpful. Now, the key is working with a psychiatrist who really understands compulsive sexual behavior and can match the right medication to your specific symptoms and identify those underlying problems like anxiety and depression. Of course, psychotherapy can also be extremely helpful. Now, it's important to look for people who are trained in providing psychotherapy, who are psychologists or psychiatrists, things like cognitive behavioral therapy, which helps you change your thoughts around those sexual urges and replaces them with more positive things. You can use that to help recognize thought patterns that occur when you feel a sexual desire and challenge it and replace it with healthier responses. Another thing is using acceptance and commitment therapy, or ACT. This approach focuses on changing your relationship with your thoughts rather than trying to eliminate the thoughts themselves, because that is very difficult and oftentimes doesn't work. It also helps partners, if they do this together, to work together to help. And motivational interviewing, which is where your psychologist or psychiatrist will go through and see what your goals and values are to help you elucidate where you're struggling and help you find solutions. Most people need a combination approach. They'll need some sort of psychotherapy as well as medication to help them really manage these issues and develop new coping strategies and thought patterns. Bottom line, compulsive sexual behavior is a real condition where you actually struggle with control. You have urges that can't be ignored, and your life revolves around sexual behavior to the neglect of everything else. It is a real condition. It's not about a moral failure or lack of willpower. It is actually disrupted brain chemistry, dysregulated reward pathways, and sometimes even unprocessed trauma. Managing this takes time, effort, and energy, but it's important to realize you will get through it, and it's really important to get help. If you guys found this helpful, please do me a solid favor and subscribe to the channel. It is completely free and a great way to help the algorithm know that this is good quality content and share it with more people. And as always, you're going to take care of yourself because you're worth it.